There are names in history that do not need explanation. They carry their own shadow. Names that make people lean in when they are whispered. Names that travel across generations like myths. Names that have the power to freeze a room in silence. One of those names is Al Capone. He was not a president. He was not a general. He was not even a legitimate businessman. And yet, in the roaring 1920s, when the jazz clubs came alive and the streets of Chicago never slept, he was the one figure everyone knew. The one man whose reputation stretched from back alley saloons to the halls of Washington. He had a scar carved across his cheek, a trademark he hated but could never escape. He stepped out of Cadillac sedans, wearing pinstripe suits, fedora tilted low, cigar glowing between his fingers. He looked like a gentleman, but people knew. Behind that half-smile was the cold, dangerous edge of a man who would not hesitate. The newspapers called him Scarface. For more than a decade, Al Capone ruled Chicago. He controlled the liquor when America banned it. He decided which clubs could stay open, which politicians could keep their seats, which cops would keep their jobs. His empire made more than $100 million a year, at a time when most families struggled to pay rent. But what made his story unforgettable was not just the empire he built. It was the way it ended. The irony so sharp that even decades later, historians still shake their heads. Al Capone, the most feared gangster in America, the man linked to dozens of murders, was not undone by bullets, but by taxes. That is the kind of twist only real life can deliver. Imagine it, Chicago in the 1920s. The city of skyscrapers rising against the sky, of jazz echoing from smoky speakeasies, of Model T Fords rattling down cobblestone streets. A city pulsing with life and with crime. This was the era of Prohibition. The federal government had outlawed alcohol. No wine, no beer, no whiskey. On paper, America was supposed to be sober, clean, and moral. But in practice, people still craved the same drinks they always had. And where there is demand, there will always be supply. That supply came from men like Al Capone. Rivers of bootleg whiskey flowed into Chicago. Hidden bars, called speakeasies, opened behind locked doors. Jazz bands played while liquor was poured into glasses that should not have existed. And in the middle of it all, one man became the undisputed king. Capone wasn't just another gangster in the shadows. He was a paradox. Brutal, but charismatic. Ruthless, yet generous to those who pleased him. To the poor, he sometimes appeared like a savior, opening soup kitchens during the Great Depression. To his enemies, he was a monster who signed death warrants without blinking. This double image made him more than a criminal. He became a legend. People feared him, yes, but they also couldn't look away. And so the question lingers. How does a boy from a poor immigrant family in Brooklyn grow into the most powerful mob boss America had ever seen? What kind of choices, what kind of world creates a man like Al Capone? These are not just questions about one man. They are questions about America itself in the early 20th century, a country torn between ideals and realities, between law and desire, between morality and money. We often hear about the American dream, the promise that anyone, no matter how poor, can rise to success if they work hard. Capone's life was like a dark mirror of that dream. He did rise, he did succeed, but he didn't do it by following the rules. He did it by breaking them. Instead of studying, he dropped out of school. Instead of obeying the law, he learned how to twist it. Instead of climbing a career ladder, he built his own empire of crime. Capone proved that the dream could be twisted, that ambition without conscience could still make you rich and powerful, at least for a time. Why, a century later, do we still talk about Al Capone? Because his story has everything: power, violence, wealth, betrayal, and a downfall that no one could have predicted. He was larger than life, a real-world figure who felt like he stepped out of a movie script before movies even told his tale. And because deep down, his story is also a warning. Capone reminds us that power without limits always consumes itself. That fear can buy obedience, but it cannot buy peace. That even the most feared man can be brought down by the smallest detail. The ink of a pen, the stroke of a tax auditor's pencil. And so we begin this journey. Not with the bloody massacres, not with the courtroom drama, but with a boy named Alphonse Gabriel Capone, born in Brooklyn to a family with nothing, who would one day become Scarface. To understand the empire, you must first understand the child. To understand the Godfather of Chicago, you must first understand the streets that raised him. This is not just a gangster story. This is a story about ambition, greed, fear, and fate. Welcome to the rise and fall of Al Capone. Alphonse Gabriel Capone did not begin life as a legend. He began it like millions of other immigrant children in America, poor, overlooked, and underestimated. He was born in 1899 in Brooklyn, New York, the son of Italian immigrants who had come to America chasing the dream of a better life. His father, Gabriele, was a humble barber. His mother, Teresa, worked as a seamstress. They were honest, hard-working people, raising 9 children in a cramped apartment, struggling to make ends meet. Life in Brooklyn at the turn of the century was no fairy tale. The streets were crowded with pushcarts, shouting vendors, and the smell of smoke from coal furnaces. Garbage piled up on corners. Gangs of kids roamed the alleys, fighting for scraps of territory. For immigrant families, survival meant blending in, working hard, and keeping your head down. But young Al Capone was not the kind of boy who kept his head down. From the start, Al showed signs of rebellion. He was smart enough, but he hated authority. Teachers described him as restless, defiant, quick to anger. And in a time when corporal punishment was normal, fights between teachers and students were not unheard of. At just 14 years old, Al's life took its first dramatic turn. After clashing with a teacher, he struck back literally. He punched the teacher in the face. That act of defiance cost him everything. He was expelled from school, never to return. At an age when most kids were preparing for high school, Al Capone was out on the streets with no diploma, no prospects, and no safety net. For many, that would have been the end of opportunity. But for Capone, it was only the beginning. Without school, Al turned to the streets of Brooklyn. There, he quickly learned his first real education: the rules of survival. On the corners, he watched as local gangs shook down shopkeepers for protection money. He saw how fear could open wallets faster than kindness ever could. He ran errands for older boys, carrying messages, fetching supplies, keeping his eyes and ears open. And slowly, he absorbed a lesson that would guide him for the rest of his life. Respect in this world does not come from kindness. It comes from fear. One night, while working as a bouncer in a Brooklyn saloon, Al made a mistake that would mark him forever. He insulted a young woman. Her brother, furious, slashed Al's face with a knife. The cut ran deep across his left cheek, leaving a scar that no doctor could erase. From that day on, the streets had a new name for him: Scarface. Al hated it. He would often turn his right side toward cameras, hiding the mark. But the nickname stuck, and in time, it became part of his legend. Because in the world he was entering, a scar was not just a wound. It was a badge, a sign that you had been in the game and survived. By his late teens, Capone had drifted into the orbit of one of the most notorious street gangs in New York, the 5 Points Gang. The 5 Points were infamous. They ran gambling dens, brothels, and illegal rackets across the city. Violence was their language, and loyalty was their law. For a young man like Capone, they were both a family and a school. Here, he learned how to fight not just with fists, but with knives and guns. He learned how to keep his mouth shut when the police asked questions. He learned how to collect debts, run protection rackets, and handle himself with the swagger of a rising gangster. It was dangerous, brutal, and often short-lived. But for Al Capone, it was a path out of poverty, a path to respect, a path to power. Among the many faces in the underworld, one man stood out to Capone: Johnny Torrio. Torrio was different from the other gangsters. He wasn't just a thug. He was smart, calm, and strategic. He ran operations like a business, preferring deals over street fights, money over bloodshed, though he was not afraid of violence when it was necessary. Torrio saw potential in the young Scarface, and Capone, in turn, saw in Torrio the kind of man he wanted to become: a boss, a leader. Torrio taught him the golden rule of organized crime. Violence should never be the first move, but when it is the only move, make it fast, make it decisive, and make sure no one ever forgets it. This mentorship would shape Capone's rise, because soon Torrio would leave New York behind and open the door to a new world. In 1919, Johnny Torrio moved to Chicago, joining his uncle to expand their operations. Chicago was different from New York. It was wide open, with corrupt politicians, hungry markets, and most importantly, the looming shadow of Prohibition. Torrio invited Capone to follow him. And for Al, the choice was clear. New York had gangs, but Chicago had opportunity. It was a city ready to be conquered. And so, the boy from Brooklyn, expelled from school, scarred from a bar fight, and hardened by the streets, packed his bags and headed west. He wasn't Scarface the legend yet. He wasn't the Godfather of Chicago. He was still just Al Capone, a young man with ambition burning in his chest and a scar on his face to remind him of the cost of mistakes. But Chicago would change that. Chicago would turn him from a street thug into a king. And it all began with a drink. When Al Capone arrived in Chicago in 1919, he stepped into a city unlike any other in America. It was fast-growing, restless, and already corrupt to its core. Politicians made backroom deals, police officers looked the other way for the right price, and crime was not just tolerated, it was woven into the fabric of the city. Chicago was about to become the center of the most profitable illegal business in American history, and Al Capone was about to become its king. In 1920, the United States government passed the 18th Amendment, launching what would be known as Prohibition. Alcohol was outlawed. No more beer, no more wine, no more whiskey. On paper, America was supposed to be sober, clean, and moral. But laws don't erase desire. Americans still wanted to drink. They wanted bars, clubs, and late-night parties. And where there was demand, someone had to supply it. For men like Capone, Prohibition was not a restriction, it was an invitation. an open door to wealth beyond imagination. Capone didn't start as the boss. He came as an apprentice, working under his mentor Johnny Torrio. Torrio had taken over his uncle's operations, running gambling houses, brothels, and now bootlegging. What made Torrio different was his vision. He didn't want endless street wars like New York. He wanted efficiency, organization, a criminal empire that ran like a business. Capone absorbed every lesson. He watched how Torrio negotiated, how he bought loyalty, how he used both charm and intimidation. And slowly, Torrio gave him more responsibility. But in 1925, everything changed. Torrio was ambushed by rival gangsters. He barely survived, taking bullets to the chest, neck, and stomach. Lying in a hospital bed, he made a decision. He was done. He retired, leaving everything. The speakeasies, the brothels, the smuggling routes, the bribes, to one man. Al Capone. At just 26 years old, Scarface became the boss of the Chicago outfit. Capone ruled with both brains and brutality. He expanded Torrio's bootlegging operations, bringing in truckloads of liquor from Canada and the East Coast. He set up breweries, distilleries, and a distribution network so large it mirrored legitimate corporations. By 1927, his empire was making over $100 million a year, the equivalent of more than $1 billion today. But it wasn't just about money. Capone wanted control. Absolute control. He bribed police officers so raids never happened. He paid off politicians to make sure laws bent in his favor. He even had judges in his pocket, guaranteeing that cases would quietly disappear. And on the streets, everyone knew the rule. If you wanted to sell liquor, open a club, or run a gambling den, you paid Capone. If you didn't last long. What made Capone unique was that he didn't hide in the shadows. Unlike other gangsters, he enjoyed being a celebrity. He wore expensive tailored suits and silk ties. He dined in the best restaurants, tipping waiters with $100 bills. He sat ringside at boxing matches and rubbed shoulders with movie stars. Reporters loved him because he always gave them a quote witty, cocky, and quotable. When asked about his business, Capone once shrugged and said, "I give the people what they want. All I do is satisfy a public demand." To ordinary people, especially the poor, Capone sometimes looked like a hero. He opened soup kitchens during the Great Depression, feeding thousands who had nowhere else to go. But to rivals and enemies, he was a nightmare. Because behind the charming smile was a man who ruled with terror. Capone's Chicago wasn't just business, it was war. Rival gangs tried to take territory, hijack shipments, or kill his men. Capone responded with ruthless precision. His soldiers carried Thompson's submachine guns, the infamous Chicago typewriter. When they spoke, streets turned red. Cars would pull up, windows rolled down, and in seconds an entire block could be shredded with bullets. Witnesses rarely talked, and if they did, they often disappeared before trial. Capone understood that fear was more effective than any contract. One brutal example made 100 men fall in line. At the height of his power, Capone lived in luxury. He bought a mansion in Chicago, guarded by armed men around the clock. He traveled in bulletproof cars, smoked the finest cigars, and drank the very liquor that made him rich. To the outside world, he was untouchable. A young man, not yet 30, who had bent one of America's greatest cities to his will. Chicago belonged to Scarface. But empires built on violence always breed more violence. And power, no matter how strong, always creates enemies. Capone believed his money and influence could shield him forever. He believed fear and bribes would keep him safe. But soon, Chicago would drown in blood. And Capone's name would be forever tied to the most infamous massacre in American gangster history. It happened on Valentine's Day, 1929. By the late 1920s, Al Capone was no longer just another gangster. He was Chicago's undisputed ruler, its king without a crown. But a throne built on liquor and bribes could never be secure. Rival gangs wanted their share. Politicians grew restless. Journalists hounded his every move. Capone's answer was always the same: violence. If money built his empire, fear protected it. And nothing spread fear faster than the staccato roar of the Thompson submachine gun. Chicagoans gave it a nickname: the Chicago typewriter. It was small enough to hide in a coat, fast enough to spray 50 bullets in a matter of seconds, and deadly enough to wipe out an entire crew before anyone had a chance to run. The rattle of a Thompson became the soundtrack of Capone's Chicago. It echoed through alleys, across neighborhoods, in the middle of broad daylight. People didn't just hear it, they felt it, in their bones, in the silence that followed. Capone's greatest enemies were the North Side Gang, led first by Dean O'Banion, then by Jaime Weiss, and later by George "Bugs" Moran. The rivalry was not businesslike. It was personal. Ambushes, drive-by shootings, bombings. Chicago turned into a battlefield. Dozens of men died in the crossfire, their bodies left on sidewalks as warnings. Every attempt to kill Capone failed. He traveled in armored cars, surrounded by bodyguards, living in fortified homes. He seemed invincible. But he was not content with defense. He wanted the North Side crushed. The morning of February 14th, 1929, was cold in Chicago. Snow clung to the streets as 7 members of the North Side Gang gathered in a garage on Clark Street. They were waiting for a shipment of whiskey. What they didn't know was that it was a trap. At about 10:30 a.m., 4 men pulled up outside. 2 wore plain suits. The other 2 wore police uniforms. Inside the garage, the fake policemen barked orders. The North Side men were lined up against a brick wall. They raised their hands, believing it was just another police raid. And then, without warning, the Thompson guns opened fire. In less than a minute, over 70 bullets tore through the room. When the shooting stopped, the wall was painted with blood. 7 men lay dead or dying. Only a dog, whimpering in the corner, survived. The Valentine's Day massacre shook the nation. Newspapers plastered the photos of bodies slumped against the wall, blood pooling on the floor. It was more than just another gang killing. It was a slaughter, carried out with military precision. Though Capone was hundreds of miles away in Florida, everyone knew whose hand had guided it. The massacre carried his signature: ruthless, efficient, and unforgettable. But the irony was cruel. Instead of scaring the city into silence, the massacre did the opposite. It horrified ordinary Americans. Suddenly, Capone wasn't just a gangster running a liquor business. He was a symbol of lawlessness, a public enemy. For the people of Chicago, life became a gamble. Any wrong step, any wrong word, and you could end up in the crossfire. Shopkeepers paid protection money or shut their doors. Ordinary families whispered his name in fear, warning their children never to cross the wrong man. One resident put it simply: if you went to bed at night and woke up alive the next morning, thank God you hadn't gotten in Capone's way. The city's reputation darkened. Chicago was no longer the city of big shoulders, the city of jazz and skyscrapers. It was now the city of blood, the city of Scarface. And yet, the contradiction remained. Even as Capone's men turned streets into killing fields, he still played the part of a generous boss. He appeared at charity events, gave interviews with a smile, and famously opened a soup kitchen that fed thousands of hungry men during the Depression. Reporters were baffled. Was he a monster, a Robin Hood, or both? The truth was simple. Capone understood image. He knew fear alone was not enough. He wanted to be admired as well as feared. A man who gave the people liquor when the government said no. A man who put food on the table when others turned them away. But blood has a way of staining everything, no matter how much good you try to mix in. And the massacre left a mark that not even Capone's charm could erase. After Valentine's Day, Capone's empire was bigger than ever. Rivals fled, cowed by the brutality of his methods. For a moment, it looked as though nothing could touch him. But while the massacre removed enemies, it created something worse: attention. The public was horrified. Politicians were pressured to act. Federal agents began to focus not just on bootleggers, but on Scarface himself. Capone had wanted to scare Chicago into obedience. Instead, he had woken up the rest of America. The king of Chicago still lived in luxury, still smoked his cigars, and counted his profits. But the walls around him were beginning to close, because in the end, it wouldn't be a rival gangster that destroyed him. It wouldn't be a Thompson gun. It would be the government. And their weapon was not a bullet. It was a piece of paper. For years, Al Capone lived like he was untouchable. He had bribed police officers, bought politicians, and intimidated judges. Witnesses who dared speak against him disappeared. Every time the law came close, the trail went cold. But empires built on arrogance always miss something. And Capone's weakness was hiding in plain sight, not in bullets, not in betrayal, but in paperwork. After the Valentine's Day massacre, Capone's name was on every newspaper. He wasn't just a gangster anymore. He was public enemy number one. President Herbert Hoover, embarrassed that one man could mock the entire justice system, gave a direct order: "I want Capone in jail. Whatever it takes." The FBI tried, local police tried, but evidence of murder was impossible to stick. Capone never pulled the trigger himself. His men were loyal. Fear kept mouths shut. Bribes kept files buried. It seemed hopeless, until the government turned to an unlikely group of men: accountants. The Internal Revenue Service was not known for fighting gangsters. Their job was paperwork, not shootouts. But one clever prosecutor realized something powerful. If Capone made millions of dollars a year and never paid taxes, he could be charged with tax evasion. It sounded almost laughable. Was it possible that the most feared gangster in America could be brought down by accountants with ledgers and pencils? But the law was clear. No matter how the money is earned, legally or illegally, it is taxable. And Capone had never filed a return. For months, IRS investigators dug into scraps of evidence: old ledgers from gambling houses, receipts for luxury suits, bank slips with Capone's name. Piece by piece, they built a paper trail. Meanwhile, Capone mocked the government. He once boasted, "They can't collect legal taxes from illegal money." But he was wrong. In 1931, prosecutors announced that they had enough to indict him, not for murder, not for smuggling, but for failing to pay his taxes. The country was stunned. The headlines were almost comedic: "Scarface charged with tax fraud." But behind the laughter was a sense of justice. If bullets couldn't bring him down, maybe numbers could. The trial began in October 1931. Capone walked into the courtroom with his usual swagger, wearing a tailored suit and flashing his famous smile. He thought it would be another performance, another game he could win. He had already arranged bribes for jurors. But the government was ready. At the last moment, the judge swapped the jury pool with another group to avoid corruption. Capone's lawyers were outmaneuvered. Witness after witness testified to the millions that flowed through his empire. Accountants laid out the figures with cold precision. The image of the untouchable gangster began to crack. On October 17, 1931, the jury delivered its decision. Al Capone, the most feared gangster in America, was convicted on 5 counts of tax evasion. The sentence: 11 years in federal prison, a $50,000 fine, and court costs. At that time, it was the harshest penalty ever given for tax crimes. The press erupted. The irony was too perfect. Capone had ordered murders, run prostitution rings, bribed officials, and built an empire on blood. Yet what finally put him behind bars was nothing more than unpaid taxes. As one newspaper put it, "The pen has proved mightier than the gun." Capone left the courthouse not as a king, but as a criminal. For the first time, the smile was gone. The swagger was gone. He was in handcuffs, escorted by marshals, no longer untouchable. The mighty Scarface had been reduced to just another inmate. The conviction sent a message across America. No one was above the law, not even the most powerful gangster. For ordinary citizens, it was a moment of relief. Chicago's long nightmare seemed to be ending. But for Capone, it was the beginning of a new nightmare. One without bodyguards, one without power, one without escape. He was sent first to Atlanta, and later to the fortress-like prison on Alcatraz Island. And there, behind the cold stone walls, the real punishment began. Capone had survived bullets, betrayal, and wars in the streets. But prison was different. It stripped him of everything: his wealth, his influence, his pride. And worse, an enemy he had long ignored was waiting for him inside. Not a rival gangster, not the law, but his own body. A disease, silent for years, was about to destroy him from within. The clang of a prison gate is the sound of finality. For Al Capone, that sound marked the true end of his empire. Gone were the tailored suits, the cigars, the champagne. Gone were the bodyguards who once shadowed his every step. In their place was a prison uniform, a number on a file, and the cold reality that Scarface was now just another inmate. Capone's first stop was the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. Even there, he tried to live like a boss. He bribed guards, arranged special privileges, and still acted like the man who ran Chicago. But the government wasn't finished humbling him. In 1934, he was transferred to Alcatraz, the infamous island prison in San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz was built for one reason: to break the spirit of men who thought they were untouchable. Isolated by icy waters and guarded with military precision, there was no escape, no bribery, no power plays. For the first time, Al Capone had nothing. Even before prison, Capone had carried a secret enemy. Years earlier, in the reckless days of his youth, he had contracted syphilis. For years it lay hidden, untreated. Now, behind bars, it began to eat away at him. At first, it was headaches and fatigue, then memory lapses, then paranoia. The sharp mind that once calculated smuggling routes and bribes began to slip. Guards noticed strange behavior. Capone would pace endlessly, muttering to himself. Some days he sat in a corner, rocking like a child. Other days he smiled blankly, as if lost in a world of his own. He played the mandolin in the prison band, strumming soft tunes that seemed heartbreakingly out of place in such a fortress of stone. The man who once commanded armies of gangsters was now fading, cell by cell, note by note. Prisoners who once feared him now pitied him. He was overweight, weakened, and often confused. Doctors eventually declared that his mental capacity had fallen to that of a 12-year-old child. The image of Scarface, the ruthless, untouchable king of Chicago, was gone. In his place stood a broken man, no longer feared, no longer respected, no longer in control even of himself. For Al Capone, perhaps this was the cruelest punishment of all. In 1939, after serving 7 years of his 11-year sentence, Capone was released early due to his failing health. He returned not to Chicago, but to his mansion in Palm Island, Florida. But homecoming was not triumph. His empire was gone. His rivals had either died or moved on. His name, once on the front pages, now appeared only in whispers of pity. In the warm Florida sun, he shuffled through the halls of his mansion like a ghost of the man he once was. He fished quietly on the docks. He wandered his gardens. He spoke nonsense to family members, reliving moments of his past as if they were happening again. The king had returned to his palace, but the crown had crumbled. On January 25, 1947, Al Capone suffered a stroke, followed by pneumonia. His body, weakened by disease, could no longer fight. He died surrounded by family, at only 48 years old. There was no grand funeral parade, no throngs of mourners filling the streets. Just a quiet service, a man once larger than life reduced to a headline, then to history. Think about it. Al Capone had survived assassination attempts. He had outmaneuvered rival gangs, bribed politicians, and mocked the law for years. He had built an empire worth millions, ruled a city with fear, and lived like a king. Yet in the end, he was undone not by a bullet, but by a disease he had ignored. Not by an enemy in the streets, but by the silence inside his own body. It was an ending almost Shakespearean in its irony. The mighty Scarface, reduced to a frail, confused man, forgotten in his own home. But even death could not erase his name. Even in decline, even in ruin, Al Capone left behind something that has outlived him. A story. A story of power, violence, wealth, downfall, and lessons that still echo today. Because Al Capone's life is more than the tale of a gangster. It is a mirror reflecting the dangers of greed, ambition, and arrogance. And in the final chapter, we will ask, what does his legacy mean for us now? Al Capone, a name that still lingers in the air like cigar smoke, long after the man himself is gone. He began as the son of poor Italian immigrants, a boy who never made it past 8th grade. He rose through the ranks of street gangs, learned the rules of the underworld, and carved his identity with a scar across his cheek. By his mid-20s, he wasn't just another thug. He was the boss of Chicago. His story is not just the story of one man. It is the story of a country wrestling with itself, its laws, its desires, its contradictions. To some, Capone was a monster, a ruthless gangster who ordered murders, orchestrated massacres, and ruled by fear. To others, he was a folk hero, the man who gave people liquor when the government banned it, who opened soup kitchens when the Great Depression left men starving. This paradox is what keeps his story alive. He was both villain and benefactor, destroyer and provider, feared and admired. But history has a way of stripping away myths. When the smoke clears, what remains is not the glamour, but the truth. And the truth is simple. Capone built his empire on crime, and crime always collapses. For all his violence, all his power, all his millions, Capone was not brought down by bullets. He was brought down by taxes. That irony is why his story feels almost like a fable, a cautionary tale. The most feared gangster in America, a man linked to countless murders, was finally punished for failing to fill out forms. It was almost comical, but it was also profound, because it proved that no one, not even Scarface, was above the law. Al Capone represents many things at once. He is the dark side of the American dream, a poor immigrant boy who made it big, not by working hard within the system, but by breaking it apart. He is the embodiment of Prohibition's failure proof that laws without public support create black markets, and black markets breed monsters. He is a symbol of absolute power, how money and fear can corrupt everything: police, courts, politics, even public opinion. But most of all, he is a reminder of how quickly it can all vanish. One day Capone was the king of Chicago. The next, he was a prisoner in Alcatraz, strumming a mandolin, his mind slipping away. So what lessons can we take from Capone's life? One: fear can buy obedience, but never loyalty. Capone ruled with fear, but in the end, fear isolated him. No true loyalty, no lasting allies. When he fell, there was no one left to catch him. Wealth without integrity is worthless. He had millions, yet it couldn't save him from disease, from prison, from the collapse of his empire. Money bought him power, but not peace. 3. No empire built on crime will endure. History is filled with kings and conquerors who rose and fell. Capone's empire lasted barely a decade. His name endures, but not as a model of success, as a warning. Decades after his death, Capone is still everywhere. His name has been immortalized in books, movies, television, even songs. He became the blueprint for the gangster archetype. From The Godfather to Scarface, countless characters owe something to him. He fascinates us because he embodies contradictions we can't look away from: charm and cruelty, power and decay, success and ruin. But those depictions often blur the truth. The real Al Capone was not glamorous. He was not invincible. He was a man who made choices, and those choices caught up with him. Picture it. Al Capone, once the king of Chicago, sitting in his Florida mansion, overweight, confused, playing with his grandchildren, his mind reduced to that of a child. That is the true legacy of Scarface. Not the tailored suits or the roaring cars, not the jazz clubs or the Thompson guns, but the slow, quiet, inevitable fall of a man who believed he was untouchable. So when we speak his name today, what do we really remember? Do we remember the gangster who ruled Chicago with blood? Do we remember the folk hero who fed the poor? Or do we remember the irony of his downfall, the man who had it all and lost it all to something as ordinary as taxes? Perhaps the answer is all three. Because Capone's life is not just history. It is a mirror, a reminder that ambition without limits, power without conscience, and greed without restraint will always destroy the man who holds them. What do you think of Al Capone? Was he a monster, a Robin Hood, or something in between? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because in the next episode, we'll travel from the streets of Chicago to the jungles of Colombia, to meet another man who became a legend of crime, Pablo Escobar, the king of cocaine.